I got this car for free from a family member. It leaked too much oil for them to drive, and so they just parked it. I loaded it up on my winch trailer, brought it home, and then during COVID, I went ahead and tore it down and discovered what the leak is about. This video is just about refinishing of the hood. Because it was a salvage title. It was a front end collision. The top part of the motor, intake manifold and everything, decapitated. But somebody put a hood on this and then painted it with single stage paint, really cheap. They didn't do any prep, they didn't seal it, and so inevitably it had a whole bunch of pinholes from rock chips, and each of those rusted deep. I tried to salvage that. That was futile, learned from my mistakes. And then I went and did this right with the sealer, 3 coats of base and 2 coats of clear. And now it looks nice, it looks great. Stay tuned for a 6-part series on getting this salvage title back to restored status. The title already says restored, but now it is really restored.
Brian's Mobile One.
Welcome to part 6 of the free Subaru restoration project, also known as the hood video. So looking at this front here, you can see these little rock chips, and then there's a swelling that happens around it. When you go chip it off, see all the dirt underneath of that? All that dirt just sits in there, and it just swirls around and works it loose. The paint just looks terrible. These are some concepts that are surrounding to this project of scope creep. If you're not familiar with that term, good for you. What it means is that you take on a project and it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. I did this probably the hardest, longest way possible, but that's what it took to convince me to spend the money in order to do it right. It's not cheap when you do it right, and if you want it right and fast, it's not cheap. If you want it cheap and fast, it's not right, and if you want it right and cheap, it's not fast. I did it the worst way possible because I tried to save money. That's basically the moral of this story. You can do it right or you can do it twice. I wound up having to do it twice because I didn't do it right the first time. Doing it right takes half the time, so you can imagine it took me a lot of time. As I was doing this project, this got all confused, and part of that has to do with my personality. I'm a little bit OCD and I like to do things right. So if I get a cheap car as a project, more often than not, I'm going to invest more into that. This time I tried to backpedal on that and I tried to save as much money as possible. The other problem is I did a really good job on the engine, but I wasn't as worried about the cosmetics of it because it's a cheap car. Nobody expects it to look amazing. However, my family members were just kind of watching from the sidelines, like, what's he gonna do with this one? And a few people had interest in it, and I didn't want it to suck if they got it. I didn't know who the car was gonna go to, and so I wanted to make sure that I did a good job. The main function of paint is to prevent rust, and obviously the way it was done the last time didn't prevent rust, so if I were to try to patch it up, I wanted to do it in such a way that it would be cost effective and not rust again. The trouble is, I was rusty myself, and I didn't remember a bunch of principles and things I should have, and a bunch of my equipment was rusty. Literally, it had crud on the inside of it, and this set me at a real disadvantage. In addition, when I was prepping that hood to paint it, I spent so much time and work on that, and I just kept thinking to myself, if somebody would have done this right the first time, I wouldn't have sore fingers. So I just didn't want to have that happen to somebody else. If you're going to do something, do it right. The other problem that I ran into is instead of using a DA sander and feathering it in, I've got another video about a crash course, speak the language on paint. And you have to go gradually. Think of it mentally as like a farmer's pond. It goes shallow, deep, and then back up shallow again, and then you can fill that in level. Having a DA sander, dual action sander, really helps you to be able to do that. What I was trying to do is just scrub. And I mean scrub it as fast and cheap as I could, and as you can see, it didn't turn out right. I was using the angle grinder with the flap disc, and that was making short work of them, but it was also making a mess of it. I bought the sander and I bought good sandpaper. If I'd have just got this to begin with, watch how fast this goes away. It does it that fast, that good. It's more effective. It's everything about it's better. And I just wish I'd have done that. This was only $70. That's the right way to do it. Try to reinvent the wheel and you get a bumpy ride. So I was willing to pay some tuition. When you go to college, you have to pay to work your butt off and you don't get anything back in return except for what you keep between your ears. And I was willing to make some sacrifices doing this so I could get some things between my ears for some future projects that I had coming up. And the good news is it worked. I got results like this because I'd put my hours in and paid that tuition. I learned some things. You don't know what you don't know, you know? And some of the unknowns, I'm going to go through them and how those led to some mistakes. I got blindsided on some things. The first of which was there was mixed adhesion on the hood. I thought because the paint was coming off, I could take a razor blade and just strip it really easily, but as it turned out, it took several times longer because where it was really easy, where it had been chipping before, other places were really hard to get off. So then I had to change strategies from razor blade to using paint stripper. And paint stripper is a bit of a process. You have to make sure that it stays wet by covering it with plastic, and you have to go on really thick from the beginning. You can't just put a little bit on and go as, you know, willy-nilly. You really have to let it work into it. The next thing I ran into as I got down through all those layers of paint and whatnot was the rust pits. If it was rusted deeply, I had no idea that that was the case, and I thought, well, no problem. I've got power tools. We will beat through the rust. Unfortunately, because I did the flap sanding, there was a lot more filler that was needed. You don't realize it until you get into it, but there was a lot of rust spots. That makes it harder to get a good even surface. You have to have a lot of skill and talent to make something like that turn out smooth. So I got above my pay grade for that. And I thought, well, great, we'll pay some tuition on that and I'll learn a little bit more. We'll get to that in a minute. The next thing is, as I was doing this, some family members showed interest in the car, and they're like, is that done? We need a car now for this teenage driver, for this person, whatnot. And people are kind of interested. People know that I take care of stuff, I fix everything up, and the stuff that I sell, you're going to be a lot ahead of the game. My cheap strategy of just touching up the black spots had to be thrown out the window because of the rust that I discovered underneath. Because of all of the more filler needed, and using the wrong kind of glazing putty, I used 1K, which means that you just come straight out of the tube and spread it on there. I thought red car, red glazing putty, red primer, it'll be no problem, I'll get good coverage. That was wrong because everything turned out really dry. So dry, in fact, that the glazing putty drying slowly, it cracked, it had pinholes, it was a nightmare. It was just a mess. I won't use that anymore. I used another kind that's called dolphin glaze, and that was actually pretty decent, but still a lot of pinholes. And then I used some stuff that was called USC Gold, and that stuff was amazing. It was way easy to work with. If I'd have done that to begin with, my Dunning-Kruger effect would be a lot higher. It's when you think that you know more than you do know, just because, anyway. The paint color was really expensive, and it is so thick with metallics that it actually clogged up the paint gun on the second one. When I let it sit, you have to shake it back up because there's just so much metal and so much pearl in it. That makes it really expensive, and that caused me to not buy enough paint because I thought I was just going to patch these little spots, and so that kind of caught me off guard. There's lots of area, and that also caused me to not have enough because I thought I was going to do these little patches, and then I wound up having to do the whole hood because of all these other unknowns with the rust pits and whatnot. Another thing that caused me to have a lot, we'll talk about here in a sec, my paint gun. I hadn't messed with it for a while. I had a really cheap paint gun, and it did great. I painted a motorcycle and a boat and some other things with it, and I had great results. Threw it in a box, pulled it out, and just thought I could just get to it and paint with it. But the humidity in the air caused the aluminum to corrode, so I had a white powdery crap that was in it, and then that used up a lot of the paint as I was getting going, and I already didn't have enough. Sealer is a lot cheaper color. It's an unknowns category, so I didn't know about sealer. I knew about primer, and I thought that was good enough. Sealer, it's like gesso on a canvas when you go to paint. It just really works to make everything show whatever color it is when you put it on. It's like a clean slate. The primer that I used, and also the glazing putty, it just soaked up way too much paint. It was like a sponge. Instead of the paint sitting on top and getting good coverage, it would soak it in, and then you'd see an outline of where I had been. The last one, I should have sanded with a guide coat. That's when you spray black spray paint or use a 3M powder pad to get a better result. And that way you know if you're getting highs and lows and all that kind of stuff. That helps you to know where to put the glazing putty, and it also helps you to know where to sand. You see these arrows where I'm going down and this way and up. When you're sanding, you don't just go like in one spot and I just try to go on the edges and get rid of the edge. That creates a moat around the thing where your glazing putty becomes the castle, and then you got a low spot around it and then the hood. We're not in the medieval times. We want it nice and you get that by doing a guide coat. Otherwise you have a wavy surface, and if you try to cut and polish it later because you're painting in a dusty environment. You have to wet sand the nibs off and then buff it back to shine. You're going to have all kinds of motes and wavy, patchy kind of stuff. And that's what I had on the first hood. In learning from this, I bought a new air compressor, so I had enough CFMs. So everybody knows CFM stands for air getter done units. It's just the amount of volume of air that your air compressor can do. If your paint gun uses a lot of air, you've got to back it up with the right kind of compressor. So I had a clogged gun, not enough volume of air. I had glazing putty and primer soaking things up, and I didn't have a nice even surface because I didn't know about sealer. So I mean, it was just a losing fight from the get-go. Wrong plan, wrong strategy, all that kind of stuff. I kind of knew by the time I got to the rust pits that I was in trouble, and I thought I really should get a new hood, but I thought, well, I'm going to pay some tuition on this. And I guess it's kind of good that I did, because now I know better how to handle other projects going forward. $100 in tuition to learn all this stuff, that's not a bad deal. All right, we talked about the first hood and the mistakes that I made and the unknowns. Now we're going to talk about G.I. Joe knowledge. Knowing is half the battle. Second hood success came because I started with a rust-free hood. I bought a new hood, and that made all the difference to have a smooth, reliable substrate and not have to worry as much about rust, and not have to old lady swallow a fly and a spider to catch a fly and a bird to catch us up on. It was a lot easier. Coulda, shoulda done this to begin with. I didn't realize what I was up against the first time. The next best thing that I took as far as knowledge was the sealer. Because I used sealer, the paint was more uniform, more efficient. I didn't get tempted to paint too much in an area because it was showing patchwork and all that other stuff from this. It's just like everything went a lot better. Instead of just a single stage paint, I bought a whole bunch of clear. I bought a whole bunch more base so I could have good coverage. One of the advantages of using the old hood is the bottom side was already painted. No rock chips, no rust, no problems. But because I committed and bought enough material, I could do the bottom. In spraying the bottom, it's good to use a PPS system. It's like an adapter that makes you more environmentally friendly because you don't have to have acetone to clean out the cup of your gun. Whatever is left, you just throw it away, which sounds wasteful, but in the end, it winds up being more environmentally friendly because there's less chemical waste. So reduce chemical waste, a little bit more plastic waste. But it does pack down, and they're not that thick, and so it works out to be a pretty good system. The other advantage, and the reason why I call it PPS Superpowers, is because you can spray upside down or sideways or like this. Basically, the hopper on the paint gun, you can have it way back like this, and it's no problem because it collapses the disposable part of it. So I can spray the bottom of the hood more effectively. I was intimidated about doing that before, because it would have been really hard to do that because then all of your paint tips to the back and now you're just spraying air and just all over the bottom, right? Next good thing I did is I had good CFM compressor. I had lots of getter done air units, so it was easy to keep my wet edge and the smooth wet look. Whenever you're spraying something, you want to start on one side and you want to overlap, just like shingles. You want to have your overlap, you spray this one, the next spray pattern's here, then here, and so on and so forth. This makes everything lay down really smooth and really wet, so you don't have as much back end work to do. We'll talk more about that in a minute. The other thing that really helped a lot was don't overthink it, it's just paint. That's a takeaway from Brian from Paint Society. And if you cover your bases and do these things right, and you have all of these things in order, you don't have to overthink it. You don't have to like try to catch stuff on the run, and you don't have as many runs. The other thing was a good clean paint gun. I got a higher quality paint gun. The other cheap one actually does a pretty good job, but it wears out, it corrodes. The chemicals that go through it tear it up, and then you have problems like we saw in the last one. With a good clean paint gun, we have good consistent atomization, and then you have less work on the back end. The better you can lay it down because you can see, because you can breathe, because of all of that kind of stuff, the better work you can turn out. I actually had problems through both of these hoods trying to use a mask that was for welding. It was a small mask, and it made me sound like this, but the worst part was I had an exhale thing that would accumulate a lot of water because it was so close and tight to my face, and you would actually drip water on the wet paint. That causes all kinds of headache and problems, that you have to fix on the back end. Also, having the bigger filters actually helped a lot to breathe better, think better, everything went better. In the long run, it was a better thing to do because now I could get a whole bunch of work done. I still need to paint the door on my Ram 2500. It got some damage while I was out of town. Anyway, we'll get that done, and it's less of a stress thinking about when I'm going to do that because I have all these takeaways. And every time I look at my 4Runner, I'm like, oh, that looks great. Lots of good going to the family. All good things. Paying tuition is paying dividends. And all that paying tuition paid off. I was able to help my sister-in-law. I was able to help my stepsister-in-law with having a good car. I was able to help my father-in-law by fixing the tailgate, and basically that project mirrored this one. And then instead of using the junk tailgate that he had, I practiced on it, didn't work out, and then I bought a new tailgate, painted it, sealed it, everything worked out good. And because of that practice, if I need to create a smooth surface, I'm really good at that, and I'll have to do that on my truck. So in the end, paying tuition, it pays off. Getting good equipment, that helps out a lot. And then you're not as shy about tackling a project going forward. So I've got all kinds of skill set and tools, so now when I fix the door on this, it'll turn out great. Plus, I need some better fender flares. I've been meaning to get some bushwhacker action going on this. I need to talk to some of the contacts there and see if we can get a video going on for them. I'm tired of editing this video, but it wouldn't be complete without showing you how to get rid of the dust nibs. When you paint at home, you're going to get dust nibs, you're going to get orange peel, and dry spray. I'm using a razor blade here. There's a better tool that I learned about that's a Fest tool. I've been using that. It's easier to hold on to. For one, it's got a little lanyard on it, and it never goes dull like the other razor blades when I was scraping things off. But the first thing you do, you scrape that off, and then you sand it with 1000 grit sandpaper. Once you've done that, you go back and buff it, and that's a fun thing to watch. So let's watch that. It looks beautiful where it's been polished, but everywhere else, this was 2000 grit. This edge is 1000 grit that I haven't hit yet, and this is 2000. It's really smooth. We're gonna hit that with a buffer. So I'm just gonna focus on one little area at a time. I'll smear this all over. We're pretty much gonna get all that area. All right, so that's probably enough. Well, that 2000 grit is earning its keep big time. Despite buffing cars and headlights and everything for years, getting this speed, quit turning it sideways, dude. You're gonna burn a hole. You're supposed to hold it flat like this and go nice and slow. I get in a hurry because I want to check underneath to make sure I'm not burning through, so I move way too fast. This can contribute to swirls and whatnot. So you get a little residue that builds up, and then when you wipe it off, it looks like this. So as far as I'm concerned, the hood is done. I got the new fog lights put in. To the untrained eye, this looks perfect, but as I move across, you can see the tiger striping. That's from rushing it, just like I was rushing with the buffer, and not keeping the wet edge and overlapping that whole shingle thing I was talking about. Do not try to add more thickness so that you can sand later. The worst thing you can do is that, because if it does pop. So this little tiny golf ball divot, if I can get it to focus, is a place where I did too much base too thick, and then it gases, the air bubbles come up later. Unfortunately, you can have the same thing happen if your mask drips on the paint. I don't remember if that was too thick or from the drip, because one caused the other. I had to go back and fix it, and then went too thick. I think I filmed about 45 hours or so and worked for weeks to get to this point. I learned a lot. Hopefully I've been able to transfer some of what I learned to you guys. As far as editing this video, it was a beast to edit, and I'm happy to say I think I've conveyed what I need to do, and so this is the time to end it.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to click like and subscribe. Bonus footage at the end.
After all, you got to have something nice to look at while you're waiting to click an end card. Here you go. Gnarly, huh? I don't care. Plus, it's a good opportunity to announce the next video being this dash camera, upon which there's going to be a giveaway where I'm giving away 3 of them on my Instagram page. So be sure to follow Brian's Mobile One on Instagram. And while we're at it, and we're just doing all kinds of Easter eggs for people that hang around to the end, I ought to announce that I've got another video series coming, some foreshadowing on the 4Runner. So stay tuned. We got all kinds of stuff coming up on this.